The dog hit the floor before anyone heard the doors open. That was the thing nobody talked about later. Not the blood, not the shouting, not the way 3 orderlies pressed themselves against the wall when 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois landed between them and the gurney. What nobody talked about was how quiet it was first. 1 second, the trauma bay hallway was empty. The next, there was a dog, low and trembling and absolutely certain about where it needed to be. The man on the gurney had a name, Staff Sergeant Elliot Greer, according to the transfer paperwork. But for the first 4 minutes after he came through the doors of Bayside Veterans Medical Center in San Diego, he was just a chest that wasn't rising right and a pressure cuff nobody could get close enough to attach. Because of the dog. Nora Walsh had been finishing a chart at the nurse's station when the call came overhead. She'd been on shift for 6 hours, had eaten half a granola bar, and was approximately 45 seconds away from her first real coffee of the evening. She heard the alert and she went. That was the job. That was who she was. She did not expect the dog, Atlas Heel. The military handler, a young corporal who looked barely old enough to shave, was trying to keep his voice flat and authoritative, but his hands were shaking. Atlas, I said, heel. The dog did not heel. The dog stood over Sergeant Greer's chest, with its body parallel to the gurney, head low, eyes tracking every person in the corridor with the focused intensity of something that had decided, on its own terms and by its own calculus, that every human being in that building was a potential threat. What is the situation? Nora said. Not a question. A demand for information so she could do her job. The corporal, as Tag Red Finch, looked at her like he'd never been spoken to that way by someone in scrubs. He's my sergeant. Atlas is his dog. It was an IED, ma'am. 22 hours ago. Atlas hasn't left his side since the field hospital. They brought them both because nobody could get Atlas away from him long enough to. Is Atlas current on his shots? Ma'am? Vaccinations. Is the dog current? Finch blinked. Yes, ma'am. He's a working dog. Then the dog stays. She looked at the transport medic behind the gurney. Vitals. BP's 88/60 and dropping. Suspected internal bleed. Possible pneumothorax on the left side. He's been in and out for the last 4 hours. Nora stepped toward the gurney. Atlas swung his head toward her immediately, and the sound that came out of him was not quite a growl. It was something lower, more certain. A frequency that said, I have already made my decision about you, and you have not been cleared. She stopped. Not because she was afraid, though she was, a little, in the way anyone with sense would be, but because she understood what she was looking at. The dog wasn't being aggressive for the sake of it. The dog was doing the only thing it knew how to do for the person it loved, which was stand between him and everything else. She knew that feeling. Okay, she said quietly. She kept her voice even, the way she'd learned to keep it in the ICU, in the NICU, in every room where panic was the wrong energy to bring. Okay, Atlas. The dog's ear moved. Just one. She didn't move any closer. She stood exactly where she was and she looked at the dog, not at the man on the gurney, not at the monitor, not at the chaos organizing itself around her. I know, she said. I know what you're doing. I'm not going to ask you to stop. The second ear turned toward her. Finch made a small sound. What are you? Ma'am, we really need to. Give me 30 seconds. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and took out a pen. She uncapped it slowly, made sure Atlas could see the motion, and then she did something that made every person in that corridor hold their breath. She crouched down to the dog's eye level. Atlas showed his teeth. She didn't move back. I need to help him, she said. Still quiet. Still even. That's the only reason I'm here. The only reason any of us are here. You've been doing your job for 22 hours. Let me do mine. The dog looked at her for a long time. Then it sat down. Not out of the way, it didn't move from the gurney's side, but it sat, and the growling stopped, and the transport team exchanged glances over Nora's head like they'd just watched something they didn't have a category for. All right, Nora said, standing up. Let's move. Sergeant Greer came out of surgery at 2:17 in the morning. He'd had a splenic laceration and a partial pneumothorax and 3 broken ribs. And the surgeon said it was honestly impressive that he'd been conscious at all during transport, let alone that he'd apparently been arguing with the field medics about whether Atlas could fit inside the helicopter. He had won the argument. Atlas had fit inside the helicopter. The dog was in the recovery room when Greer woke up, sitting on a folded military blanket that Corporal Finch had apparently produced from somewhere. Atlas was embroidered on the blanket in block letters. Someone had made that for the dog. Nora noticed that and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have time to examine right now. She was doing her overnight check when Greer's eyes opened. "Easy," she said immediately, because his first instinct was to sit up, and his body was not going to allow that for several days. "You're at Bayside Veterans. You're out of surgery. You're okay." He lay back. His eyes moved to the left, found Atlas, and something in his face unknotted so completely that it almost looked like pain. "Good boy," he said. His voice was raw from the intubation. "Good boy." Atlas stood up, crossed the 2 feet between his blanket and the bed, and pressed his nose against Greer's hand. Nora adjusted his IV line and pretended she wasn't watching. "You're the one who got him to stand down," Greer said. "Not a question. Finch told you?" "Finch tells me everything. It's his most annoying quality." He turned his head to look at her properly, which clearly cost him something. "How'd you do it?" "I just talked to him. People have been just talking to him for 22 hours. She shrugged. "Then I said different things." He watched her for a moment. "What's your name?" "Walsh. Nora Walsh. How long you been a nurse?" 8 years. "Military?" "No." He seemed to accept that. He was quiet for a while, and she thought he'd gone back to sleep, but then he said, "He doesn't trust women. Usually. Not since." He stopped. "Doesn't matter. He trusted you. He trusted that I wasn't going to hurt you. How'd he know that?" She finished her notes and clicked her pen. "I don't know. Maybe ask him." Greer almost smiled. She could see the edge of it before the pain medication pulled him back under. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the recovery room, the dog asleep beside the bed, the monitors making their small patient sounds, the city outside doing what cities do at 2 in the morning. She had a stack of other charts waiting. She had 11 other patients and a medication pass due at 4 a.m. and a coworker who'd called in sick, which meant she was running the floor alone tonight. She left the room and got back to work. 3 days later, Sergeant Greer was moved to a regular room, and things started to go wrong. She didn't notice it at first. She was busy, and the floor was short-staffed, and the wrongness was quiet enough that it could have been mistaken for nothing. A chart pulled up twice for a patient who had no scheduled follow-up. A medication order flagged and then unflagged without explanation. A man she didn't recognize in gray scrubs near the nurse's station who disappeared when she turned around. The fourth thing was not quiet at all. She came into Greer's room at 6:45 for morning vitals, and Atlas was standing in the center of the room, not beside the bed, and the sound coming out of him was different from anything she'd heard before. Lower. Continuous. Like a machine that had been turned on and couldn't be turned off. Greer was awake, sitting up, one hand on the IV pole and his eyes on the window. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Lock it." She locked it. "Someone was in this room," he said. 40 minutes ago. Atlas woke me up. I hit the call button and nobody came." She looked at the call log on the wall panel. It had been pressed at 6:02 a.m. It was logged as a false alarm, resolved by staff. She hadn't received that call. She'd been at the station all morning. "Who resolved it?" Greer asked. He'd already read her face. "I don't know yet." "Walsh." His voice was very steady. "I'm not a paranoid man. I've been injured before. I know what a hospital room feels like at 6 in the morning, and I know what it feels like when someone's in it who isn't supposed to be." Atlas was still standing in the center of the room, still making that sound. "I believe you," she said. She went to the nurse's station and pulled up the overnight incident log. The false alarm entry at 6:02 had been entered under a staff ID she didn't recognize. She looked at the ID number and pulled up the staff directory. The number returned a name, L. Donahue. Physical therapy aide, assigned to the 3rd floor. Greer's room was on the 4th floor. She stood there for a moment, looking at the screen, feeling that specific cold clarity that comes when something clicks into place and you wish it hadn't. She called the charge nurse on 3. Asked her to check if Donahue was in yet. "He called out this morning," the charge nurse said. "Family emergency, apparently." "Why?" "Just checking," Nora said. "Thanks." She hung up and stood very still in the middle of the nurse's station and thought about what she was going to do next. She had no evidence. She had a ghost entry in an incident log, a name she didn't recognize, and a dog making a sound she couldn't stop thinking about. She did not call security, because security reported to hospital administration, and she didn't know yet how far whatever this was had gotten. She called the VA's patient safety line, which routed to a federal office she'd never actually used before, and she said, "I need to report a potential security breach involving a patient with a military protective flag. His name is Greer, Elliot James, room 412. The person on the other end asked her to hold. She held. 2 men arrived at 9 a.m. They were in civilian clothes and they had IDs that said Department of Defense, Office of Special Investigations. The taller one introduced himself as Kaufman. The other one didn't give his name, just his rank, which was sufficient. They went into Greer's room and closed the door. Nora went back to her patients. At 10:30, Kaufman came to find her. "You made the report," he said. "Not accusatory, just confirming. Yes, you're the same nurse who got the dog to stand down on intake. Also yes." He looked at her for a moment with the kind of professional appraisal she associated with people who needed to quickly categorize whether someone was an asset or a complication. "Can I ask you something, Walsh? You're going to ask me something regardless." "Fair." He leaned against the counter. "What made you call the federal line instead of hospital security?" She thought about how to answer that. She picked the simple version. "Because I didn't know who to trust inside the building. That's a significant call to make." Someone entered a patient's room at 6 in the morning, used a staff ID that belongs to a person who called out sick, and logged a false alarm that never reached the floor nurse. She looked at him. How significant was it really? He was quiet for a moment. Then, Greer's unit was running an operation in a location I can't discuss. The IED wasn't random. Someone with specific knowledge of the route placed it. "We've been looking for the information source." "And you think they followed him here?" "We think someone is trying to confirm what he knows before we can debrief him." He paused. "Which means anyone who's had access to his room is potentially on someone's list." She absorbed that. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It's information. What you do with it is your business." "My business," she said, "is making sure my patient gets better. I'd appreciate if your business didn't complicate mine." Kaufman almost smiled. Almost. That afternoon, a woman came to the 4th floor. She had a visitor badge and a flower arrangement and a name on the sign-in sheet. Corinne Delaney, listed as a friend of the patient. Nora didn't flag it. People had visitors. That was fine. She watched from across the corridor as the woman walked toward room 412, took note of the particular way she paused outside the door, just for a half second, just long enough to be deliberate, and then Nora was already moving. "Excuse me." The woman turned. She had a calm face. Professional calm, the kind that doesn't come naturally. "Yes, room 412 isn't accepting visitors today. Doctor's orders. I can direct you to the waiting area if you'd like to." "I called ahead," the woman said. The receptionist confirmed. "The receptionist doesn't have access to physician hold orders." Nora smiled, made it polite, made it immovable. "I'm sorry for the confusion. If you'd like to leave those with me, I'll make sure Sergeant Greer receives them when he's able." The woman held the flowers for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she held them out. Nora took them. "I'll let the receptionist know there was a miscommunication. Thanks for coming by." She watched the woman walk back toward the elevator, watched her not look at the camera in the corner, which was a choice, and watched her press the button for the lobby, which was probably not where she was going. Nora went directly to Kaufman, who was stationed in a room 2 doors down that had been logged as a housekeeping supply closet. "Dark red carnations," she said, holding out the arrangement. "I didn't touch the stems." He looked at her for one very long second. "Walsh," he said. "There's also a woman in the elevator who has camera awareness and knows how to hold flowers like a prop." He was already on his radio. They got her in the parking garage on the 2nd level. Nora didn't see that part. She was with her patients, where she was supposed to be, doing the job she'd come here to do. She found out from Finch, who had apparently taken it upon himself to provide her with updates, that the flowers had contained a transmitter the size of a watch battery, designed to capture audio within a 12-foot radius. Someone had wanted to hear what Greer said when he thought no one was listening. The hospital administrator came to the 4th floor at 3 p.m. and asked Nora, with the specific energy of someone who had been briefed on something upsetting, why she hadn't gone through the proper internal channels. She said, "Because the breach involved a staff ID. I didn't know how far it went. That's not protocol, Walsh." "No," she said. "It's judgment." He looked at her like he wasn't sure what to do with that, which was fine. She wasn't particularly interested in being easy to categorize. Greer was sitting up when she came in for evening vitals. Atlas was on the blanket, more relaxed than she'd seen him since that first night, though his eyes still tracked the door every time the hallway sounds changed. Kaufman told me, Greer said. Okay, the woman, the flowers. He was quiet for a moment. You notice things. It's my job to notice things. Kaufman notices things too. He missed her. She checked his IV site, adjusted the flow rate. He had a lot to manage. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. She shaded a note in the chart. How's the pain tonight? Manageable. He watched her work. Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things since you woke up from surgery. I don't know why you keep questing permission. The edge of a smile again. Steer this time. Fair. Why'd you become a nurse? She thought about a lot of things when he asked that. She thought about her brother, Kevin, who'd come home from Fallujah in 2008 and not come home correctly. And about the years she'd spent figuring out what that meant and what she could do with it. She thought about the first patient she'd lost and the first one she'd genuinely saved. She thought about 8 years of overnight shifts and short staffing and the occasional administration meeting and the more frequent moments that made all of it matter. She said, someone took good care of someone I loved when I didn't know how. I wanted to be able to do that. He was quiet for a moment. Military? My brother. He nodded. He didn't push for more, which she respected. He okay now? He's okay now. Took a while, but yeah. Atlas made a sound, not a growl. Just a small vocalization, the kind that meant he was settling, that the room had been assessed and deemed acceptable. He put his head on his paws. He likes you, Greer said. He tolerates me. You don't know Atlas very well. He glanced at the dog. He's been with me for 4 years. I have seen him tolerate things. This isn't what it looks like. She looked at the dog who had closed his eyes. He knew, Greer said. That first night, he knew you weren't a threat before I even saw your face. A pause. He's got better instincts than most people I've served with. Smart dog, yeah. He leaned back against the pillows, more tired now, the adrenaline of the past several days beginning to cost him. Smart dog. She finished her notes and moved toward the door. Walsh. She stopped. Thank you. Not just for all of it. The whole thing. He looked at the ceiling. People think it's the surgery that saves you, or the medication, or the right protocol at the right time. He stopped. Started again. It's the person who looks at the dog and doesn't back up. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Get some sleep, Sergeant, she said. Donahue was picked up in Chula Vista the following morning. He'd used a personal car. He'd driven south, probably thinking he was heading for a border crossing with enough of a head start, but the transmission in the flowers had been a two-way device, and the signal had told the people, tracking it exactly where to look. Kaufman stopped by the 4th floor on his way out of the building. We'll need a formal statement, he said. The observation log, the call you placed, the incident with the visitor. I know. I'll have it ready by end of shift. You could have reported it and stepped back, he said. Most people would have. She thought about the flowers, about the pause outside the door, about the kind of attention it takes to see something wrong in a half-second hesitation. I'm a floor nurse, she said. I don't step back from things that happen on my floor. He nodded once and left. She went back to room 412, checked the chart, replaced the IV bag, and gave Atlas a brief scratch behind one ear because she'd started doing that 2 days ago and it seemed rude to stop. Atlas did not tolerate the scratch. He pressed into her hand and made a sound that was unmistakably contentment. Greer was discharged on a Thursday, 17 days after he'd come through the emergency bay doors on a gurney that had cracked the rubber stoppers against the wall. He was walking, carefully, with a slight hitch on the left side that the physical therapy notes said would likely resolve in 6 to 8 weeks, and Nora chose to believe them because she'd read the PT notes, and they were written by a careful, thorough person. Finch was there. Kaufman had sent someone from his office, a young woman with a federal badge who shook Greer's hand and said something Nora couldn't hear. There was another soldier she didn't recognize, someone from Greer's unit probably, standing near the window and looking at his phone and occasionally looking up at Greer with the specific expression of someone who was very relieved and was doing their best not to show it. Nora had discharge paperwork to go through. Wound care instructions, medication schedule, follow-up appointments. The kind of thing that had to be explained carefully and confirmed twice. She went through it with Greer while Atlas sat beside him, fully alert, watching the room. Pain management, she said. The ibuprofen is for the ribs. The other one is only if the pain breaks through, and I need you to actually use it and not decide you're fine because… I know how this goes, Greer said. Then you know that the reason I'm telling you is because I've had this exact conversation 17 times with men who did not follow instructions and came back in through the emergency bay doing the exact same impression of someone who is definitely fine. He looked at her. I'll take the medication, he said. Thank you. She finished the paperwork. He signed where he needed to sign. Finch collected the copies. The room got quieter, the efficient quiet of departure. You could come visit, Greer said. Casual, but not quite casual. Atlas would like that. I work a lot of overnight shifts. I know. You've mentioned it. He folded his copy of the discharge instructions and didn't look at her directly, which she found interesting. I'm just saying, if you were ever not working… San Marcos isn't far. She looked at him. At the careful way he was holding still, the very controlled patience of someone who had learned to wait. At Atlas, who was watching her with those steady eyes that had sized her up in a trauma bay hallway, and found her, somehow, worth trusting. I'll think about it, she said. Atlas's tail moved. Once. Twice. He's doing that on purpose, she said. He absolutely is, Greer agreed. She shook his hand. His grip was still strong despite everything, and he held on for exactly 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary. She walked them out to the lobby, watched Finch load a duffel bag into the back of a government vehicle, watched Atlas jump in with the precise coiled efficiency of a dog who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. Greer got in last. He paused with his hand on the door, turned back to look at her. She raised one hand, not a wave, just a small acknowledgement, the kind of gesture you make when words would be too much and silence isn't quite enough. He nodded, got in. The door closed. She stood on the sidewalk in the San Diego morning, the sun coming in at the angle it gets in October, low and golden and sharp, and she watched the car pull out of the lot and disappear into the ordinary traffic of an ordinary Thursday, carrying a man who wasn't ordinary at all, and a dog who had decided, on its own terms and by its own calculus, that she was someone worth standing down for. She went back inside. She had 6 patients waiting, a medication pass overdue by 4 minutes, and a floor that didn't run itself. She got back to work.